The Varangian Guard is an offspring from the Byzantine practice of hiring mercenaries to defend their empire. The map shows how the empire looked like in 975 AD, at the beginning of the reign of Emperor Basil II. The name Varangian is probably derived from the Germanic word Varangian, which meant fellowship. Merchants could be such a fellowship, but also a band of warriors. During the Viking Age, when the Scandinavians came to Russia, they became to be known as Varangians. As a result, Scandinavian bands of mercenaries were called Varangians in the Byzantine Empire. From the 10th century onwards, so-called Varangians were hired on an irregular basis by the Byzantine Empire. The policy towards Scandinavian mercenaries changed during the rule of Byzantine Emperor Basil II. In 988 AD, he demanded military assistance of the Kievan Rus ruler Vladimir. Vladimir sent 6,000 Scandinavian warriors who helped Basil to quell a rebellion of the Byzantine general named Vardas Phokas. According to legend, the mere spectacle of advancing Varangian warriors caused Phokas to suffer a stroke. It is generally accepted that the Varangian Guard was formed from men selected from this batch of warriors. Basil II was busy quelling rebellions against his rule, and he could use foreign warriors who had no relations to existing factions within the Byzantine army and administration. After 988 AD, the Varangians gradually became the permanent personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor, and by the end of the 10th century, the steady flow of Scandinavian mercenaries seeking employment in Byzantine service ensured a sound base of recruitment for at least 2 centuries to come. Basil II felt comfortable among the Varangians, because as outsiders in Byzantine society they were exclusively loyal to him, and in turn he favored the Varangians with spoils of war. Professor Romilly Jenkins has suggested that Basil's positive attitude may have originated from a Scandinavian ancestor in the person of Basil I's wife, Eudokia Ingeringa. Personally, I am not convinced that Basil was led by this kind of sentimental bias, and that his favor towards Varangians during the division of the spoils after a campaign most likely stemmed from their military value. As said, Varangians were not a novelty to the Byzantine Empire, but the constitution of the Varangian Guard brought them to the center of attention. The tall, blonde and hairy Scandinavian warriors were in any case impressive and looked exotic to the predominant Mediterranean population of Constantinople. They also brought with them their own way of fighting, like the use of the battle axe. The carrying of the battle axe became the hallmark of the Varangians, which were often depicted carrying these weapons, and they were even called after these weapons, the axe-bearers, or in Greek, pelekoporoi. The Varangian Guard was not confined to guard duties in Constantinople, because Emperor Basil II was a warrior emperor who campaigned almost every season. As his personal bodyguard, the Varangians were part and parcel of Basil's military campaign in the Middle East and the Balkans. In his book about the Varangians in Byzantine, the Icelandic professor Sigfús Blöndal regards the invasion of Syria in 999 AD as the first campaign in which we can be certain that the Varangian Guard was involved. Basil II personally led this campaign, which lasted 3 months, during which his forces swept through the Syrian countryside while destroying strongholds. This show of force paid off, and the Egyptian Caliph concluded a 10-year truce. Historical records from Basil's campaign in the Caucasus just after his venture into Syria gives us a lot of information about the composition of the Varangian Guard. The chronicler Aswechik describes them as infantrymen who were armed with spears and shields. But they also had horses. This meant that the Varangians retained their Nordic way of war, which meant that they moved on horseback but dismounted before going into battle to form typically Nordic battle formations, like the shield wall. He also notes that the Varangians had become Christians by this time, are clear indications that it took decades after the formal conversion of Scandinavian and Russian kings before Christianity was generally practiced among the population. Even after the conversion, a lot of pagan practices as symbols remained in folklore. A clear example is the recurrence of the raven on Varangian shields, a bird which is associated with the warrior god Odin. The fact that Varangians had converted to Christianity didn't make them into choir boys. Not in the last place because Emperor Basil II was a brutal emperor himself, even by contemporary standards. Basil II was nicknamed the Bulgar Slayer for his destruction of the Bulgarian Empire after he secured the eastern part of the empire. The Varangians followed him on every campaign in Bulgaria from 1001 AD onwards. This war was once again a war of brutal destruction, with few pitched battles, among which the Battle of Cladion Pass in 1014 AD. The role of the Varangian Guard in the Battle of Cladion Pass is not recorded, but their overall role in the Bulgarian campaign must have been quite significant, because in 1016 AD the emperor divided the spoils of that year's campaign as such: 1/3 for himself, 1/3 for the Varangians, and 1/3 for the rest of the army. If we take into account that the Varangians composed only a fraction of this army, a quarter at most, this was a very generous gift indeed. It reflected Basil's faith in the abilities and loyalty of the guard. He felt so secure by his personal bodyguard that he regularly went into the fray of battle. When he did so, his men would shout, "Fly, the Emperor comes!" The Varangian Guards became renowned as an elite combat unit in its own right. When the Byzantines began campaigning in Italy in 1018 AD, their commander requested and got a detachment of Varangian Guards at his disposal. According to chronicler Leo of Ostia, it was a detachment of Varangian Guards who tipped the balance in favor of the Byzantine forces in Italy. Their opponents had beaten the Byzantines until then with the help of Norman knights, but when the Varangians appeared on the scene, the Normans were thoroughly beaten. Only 10 out of 250 Normans escaped the Battle of Cannae in 1018 AD. The Varangian Guard proved once more to be a crack force when Basil campaigned against the king of Georgia, and his force was ambushed by Georgian forces. It was the Varangians who reacted immediately, attacking the ambushing force and totally routed them. Their conduct had averted a major disaster for the Byzantine army and Emperor Basil II. In 1025 AD, Basil II suddenly died while preparing a campaign. This meant the end of the Varangian Guard as a force in the field. Varangians were still hired as mercenaries, but there would be a clear distinction between Varangians in the city, essentially the guards, and Varangians in the field. The Varangian Guard, as a selected unit of imperial bodyguards, would endure for at least the next 2 centuries, but their appearance on the battlefield became rare, as most emperors were no warriors like Basil II. In literature about the Varangians, there are seldom a clear distinction between field units and the guards, which has led to the mistaken belief that the future king of Norway, Harald Hardrada, was part of the Varangian Guard. Hardrada served under the Byzantines, and he distinguished himself in Sicily, but there's no reason to believe he was part of the imperial bodyguard. I mean, he was a throne pretender of Norway, and I think no sane king or emperor would let himself be protected by somebody which is that ambitious. Varangians as mercenaries were definitely in demand, but not every Varangian ended up in the Imperial Guards, because Varangians also continued to be hired as regular troops, like in the period before Basil II. When it comes to the Varangian Guard, as an imperial bodyguard, which also proved itself in battle as a combat elite, we should be aware that this period is confined to the life of Emperor Basil II. It was under his personal banner that the Varangian Guards proved themselves to be the indispensable force for the restoration of the Byzantine Empire in the Middle East and the Balkans in the first decades of the 11th century. They were an elite force, but only in that period, I would say.